respect equals 70 to 85% chance of success. Now, what do I mean? If you have this conversation with me, and you actually know who you are, and you listen to who I am, we have an 85 to 90% chance of having a terrific relationship. And you are a minority. There's less than 1% of you in this cult that sees the profound power of that invitation. And that its power comes from the fact that no one else in their entire life has made it. And that it is based on data and intelligence rather than cult instinct and dogma. That's 1%. Now, the 1% invite a paradigm that has a 90% chance of creating higher levels of sustainable mutual well-being than the cult alternative of default projection in a hurry. If you have to give up 1 day of 4-hour media consumption and get a little bit of respite and reset your dopamine in order to develop a profoundly new friendship, is it worth it? It's a very difficult equation for someone within the cult. It's not normal, is it? Happiness, normalcy. In an abuse cult, unconscious instinct, what feels right and normal is to do what you've done before. Because in a traumatic abuse cult, everyone is traumatized to one degree to another, which means everyone is run by fear to one degree or another. And the greatest fear within every human being is the fear of the unknown. So what are you going to choose? Happiness in unknown territory or normalcy in known territory? I can't tell you how many Americans, when I've approached them, have said, "But I don't know you." Of course not. I'm an unknown. Would you like to? But I don't know you. Oh, I see. You don't want to get to know me because you don't know me. And you don't know me because you won't take the time to get to know me. And so we will remain strangers for all time. And you have just successfully dodged the bullet of seeing and being seen by another human being. Congratulations. Don't talk to strangers. The abuse statistics say you're far more likely to be abused by someone close to you in your own house or family. So if we're following intelligence metrics, the mantra would be, talk to strangers. Stay away from your family and friends, because, statistically speaking, they are not trustworthy. The next violation in this pattern of violation where we, lead towards conflict, the next violation is to resist transparency. I don't have time for this. I don't want to talk about it. Let's go do this instead. No, I didn't feel anything. No, to resist the time it takes to be seen and to argue for the status quo. So here's where you have, funny messages from women saying, men are like this. I'm a man and I'd like to talk. No, you're, guys, they're like this. Yeah, but we're talking about me and you're not. No, guys are like this. I know guys. I guess I will have to be invisible so that you can hang on to your stereotype about guys rather than actually talk to a guy. So that's the next violation. So there's violation, there's default assumption, which causes boundary crossing and harm, because it's like, imagine two invisible bodies, because that's what the psychology in our cult is. It's an invisible body. It's an emotional and mental body that you can't see, and that we're good at hiding. So it's an invisible body. Well, if I assume that you're standing here, and so I stand here because I don't want to step on you, but you're actually standing here, and I didn't know that, and so I step on you, then there's a violation. You've just stepped on me because you thought I was here, because that's where you're projecting, and you didn't ask, and I'm here. Well, the next violation is, so you have not making the time and asking. Then you have the projection. Then you have acting on the projection. Then you have the violation of stepping on someone's mental, emotional body, or crossing a physical boundary, turning up the volume, putting on music they hate, not asking. So you have all of that. And then you have the opportunity for the victim of that violation to say, hello, you didn't ask me about this, but I don't like it. Sure you do. Sure you do. So this is the next violation. You can't possibly exist differently than the person I project, but this is the best music that's ever been. So you have the resistance to seeing, which ensures a re-violation. Because if you give up and say, fine, I guess I love the music that I hate, I'm not going to argue about it, then they carry on. Isn't this great? Isn't this great? Come on, enjoy the music you hate. And so you have a continual pattern of violation. So you first deny and repress the truth, and then you persist in the behavior, because narcissistic people are not actually interested in doing what the other person wants to do. They don't love enough to care enough to attune. They love enough to want to enjoy what they like, and if they can manipulate the other person into shutting up about it, then they get to listen to the music they like and all that. And so you have a child or an adolescent in there rather than an adult, but who's counting in a cult that doesn't track inner psychological ages. So this, of course, will have impact. It will produce anger. If you understand the thermometer of the human heart, repeated violation of value hierarchies produces anger, hurt, pain, etc. So we're now 4 deep into the violation process in the inner invisible terrain that's being repressed and chauvinistically denied. And now there's impact. So the next is to deny the impact of the abuse. How can you be abused by music that's wonderful? No other world exists other than my world. So come on. And in the dominance hierarchy, we have a mix of charisma and chauvinism and sociopathic behavior in this. Because if you do it with a warm smile and come on, and I know you've got finals tomorrow and you need to study, but let's have a night on the town. I would enjoy fucking a hot college girl tonight, and I've got the charm, I've got the wine, I've got it all. And what? You ruined your ability to get into your college. Well, it's no big deal. So there's this. We don't actually know the difference between charm and sociopathic behavior. So we have charming sociopaths who are, of course, far more effective at hurting people than depressed sociopaths who we don't actually have the right metrics for actually understanding who we're dealing with. And in a cult that is chauvinistic and thus focused on extroversion, because that's the masculine expression of the psyche, then the introvert who is wanting to study and whatever will be condemned by other sociopathic extroverts for not adopting the chauvinism of the cult. Rather than the cult apologize, I'm so sorry that we are so pathologically chauvinistic and blind that we haven't even taught you the difference between a sociopath and a healthy, loving human being who's interested in your future. And having saddled you with that level of ignorance, we've then compounded it by all this blather about extroversion and smiling more as you You know, you got to learn how to smile, you know, as you stab the knife in the back in the Pink Floyd song. You know, and that's how you play the game. You know, it's not, this is one layer of stupidity and cruelty onto another. And how's an individual in a sociopathic cult that tells you to sleep, 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 and do what everyone else is doing going to wake up, you know, in this kind of environment? It's very, very difficult. So if you're analyzing that data, it's very, very upsetting to understand the odds that are stacked against an individual waking up in the matrix of this cult and actually dealing with a paradigm that is exponentially more intelligent and geared towards well-being. So the next violation is to blame the conflict and pain that results from the conflict about bringing up the feelings and impact about those first 4 violations on the victim. You know, and so here we use cult reference, because you get out of violation as soon as you attune to the individual. So this is, of course, what isn't done. No, I was just doing what's normal. What am I supposed to do? Of course I wanted you to have a drink with me. That's what idiots in our cult do. They go to loud, noisy, smelly places and drink large amounts of toxic substance that dull this and do that. That's what we do. What are you upset about? You know, and so the cults sustain themselves because they can count on a majority to back up the enactment of cult norms. Intelligence and the individual attunement and uniqueness doesn't come into it. They just exclude you from from the events if you don't go along, you know, with the cult dynamic. And the last violation is to withdraw without owning or apologizing or seeing and participating in the disintegration of community. So nature produces biodiverse psyches, a rich diversity of personality and races and colors and biases and genders and all that. That's nature. Nature's been surviving for 15 billion years. Nature's got a pretty good track record of knowing how to restore balance and symmetry even as all these chaotic things keep happening. It keeps going back to balance. You cut down a forest, nature sends in weeds to stabilize the soil, then shrubs take place, birds drop, and it restores the balance. So, you know, as we get more and more chauvinistic people in this mindset, nature sends us anomalous people. People with Asperger's syndrome, the 10-20% that are highly sensitive, people that are more feminine in predisposition here, homosexuals and lesbians. Nature sends diversity to counteract the disease of the cult, for which they are routinely punished. We do not want to take our medicine. The future of the cult lies in its diversity and its growth and its resilience to a chaotic barrage of stimuli. The more complex the ecology, the more certain it is that life in some form will continue. The more complex, empathic, and inclusive the cult is, the more likely it is that it will continue, providing, of course, we teach some degree of psychological literacy to bridge all these unique cultural differences, which is why it is the single most important subject that you could learn in an intelligent school. How to bridge culture and break down the unique distinctions in every human being, see them, learn to honor them, and learn to partner with overlapping areas of shared values and win-win to create highly complex partnering synergies. The mathematics are off the chart on the cult reality that results from that protocol versus learning to avoid the bullies, hide your feelings, tell lies to look cool, focus on sneakers, just about every single thing that happens on in school does not set you up for well-being, which is why 98% of children going into school are highly creative, highly dynamic, highly productive, and only 2% survive feeling highly creative, productive, curious, etc. once the school spits them out. We take healthy human beings, turn them into garbage, and then call them adults, meaning you're now at an age ready for the next torture protocol our cult has in store for you, based on the paradigm that the more money you make and the higher rank you have in the cult, somehow this is a great accomplishment. So the last violation is to judge, gossip, and violate the person from, and all you have to do is say they're weird. Well, we don't want that. We wouldn't possibly want someone who was weird, and so, that's enough for an unconscious, unthinking cult to just marginalize some of its most brilliant and beautiful anomalous people that have actually woken up. Because when you're anomalous in a chauvinistic cult, you understand the cult is the enemy, and so you have to start working around it. And so you actually wake up. You're outside the cult, which means you are the people that the cult needs more than anyone else to help evolve the stupidities within the cult. But in a cult like ours, the math is sound. The math is sound that we should be, in the next 5 years, shutting down all the smog stations and put $2 billion into planting trees in California alone. That's sound math. But will it be done? What about the ego of the politician who proposed the last bill? Do you really want a maniacal politician out to get revenge because you pointed out his stupidity? Let's just let the people ruin their lives to avoid encountering the abuser, among the political system. So we're not dealing with intelligence other than the intelligence of dominance hierarchies and fear. So I'm going to take a pause here, but this is most of, this is a good chunk of the terrain of conflict and suggestion for possible remediation, beginning with the break in chauvinism, which would suggest that spending 1,000 hours in this domain is one of the most intelligent things and the kindest things you could do for yourself, your future, and that the feminine in you, the inner psyche, is worth being known with respect, honor, and mastery, whether you're a male or a female. Everyone has a feminine side, everyone has a masculine side, everyone has an inner world, that's worth knowing and honoring. That the mathematical return on investment is high if you can tolerate divergence from the cult. I want to start part 2 of the exploration of, the conflict map between myself and other people with a reference to James Hillman, I believe, in the Minnesota Men's Conference, speaking about the fact that part of the lock-in in a traumatic situation is that we tend to, as we go into fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, there's a general tendency to get stuck in one of the positions of the reptilian brain. And my position that is taboo, and usually there's one that we won't go into, was fight. So there's flight, withdrawing. I've done that all my life. There's freeze. This is kind of preparing to die, which is the physiological sensation around conflict. And then there's fawn, which I've done. It's actually how I broke my elbow. The first bone that I've broken in my body was I have a very stubborn landlord, Billy, and he's irascible, highly reactive, sometimes abusive, and just off center. But the house is great, and so my strategy is generally to work around him. But he was wanting to replace a washer machine, and he had been talking about possibly vacating the property and going through a lot of trauma at the time around the sexual abuse at High. I didn't want to, I wanted to try and form a bond. And so I thought I'd help him with the washing machine. And the entire thing was a joke. And one of the reasons I've never been hurt in 25 years of landscaping is I'm in charge. But that doesn't work with Billy. And so I'm regressed at the time, just hoping that he won't add to this momentous weight of uncertainty and fear, with PTSD and all the various ripple effects of that he won't ask me to leave the house at that time. Or have another tantrum about something. And he has a bad back, and I tell him, just leave the washing machine there. I'll have my crew deal with it. Because he arrives alone with a bad back, with a 200-pound washing machine, or maybe it's 300 pounds. Anyway, and down this huge flight of stairs, and it's a ridiculous proposition. He couldn't do it on his own. He brought this winch and this board. The board broke within moments. And so I'm navigating between not wanting to compete for his necessary alpha position, and wanting to be helpful. And so I took the lower side of the washing machine in this pulley system. I don't know what happened exactly, but a 200-pound or 300-pound washing machine chased me down these concrete stairs, nearly killed me, and I broke my scapula and radial head. But this was attempting to fawn, meaning attempting to appease, beyond the comfort zone. And this is something that I feel strongly about, which is the gap between perceived reality and psychological reality for the individual person involved. Meaning the most traumatized and abused children have, first of all, they often get locked in age regression, and nobody helps them out of that. So they'll relate to the world periodically in intense conflict moments as a regressed child, as opposed to, big deal, it's just a house or whatever. And there's a certain amount of uncertainty beyond which can trigger, or re-trigger trauma. And there's a certain amount of so there's a balance. We need to find our comfort zone within all the uncertainty in the world and all of the certainty. And so I risked my life to fawn to avoid abuse by an incompetent person, and nearly died in the process. But it was out of the fear of uncertainty, and that I actually subjugated myself to a position where, as I say, I sustained my first bone break in my life. And this is one of the ways that trauma snowballs. And in our culture, we don't train people like Billy. I had told him about the sexual abuse, I told him about the trauma, the sleeping and all this stuff. But we don't teach, people to be empathic. People don't feel an empathic responsibility to hold space or support or to regulate volatility, for example. The last time you need to lose your house is when you have PTSD and the world is falling apart in various ways as a result. But we have this sociopathic notion that the fact that someone's life may fall apart because we add to that tipping point right then is not our problem. It's the world's problem that we have another person whose life falls apart. And when everyone has that idea and people are precipitating individuals, beyond that tipping point into addiction or into suicide or into violence or crime or whatever it is, we collectively pay the price of that sociopathic stupidity. And I feel very strongly about that in the United States because there hasn't been a single person who has owned any kind of accountability for regulation around, these very vulnerable periods, one. And then, in $140,000 of therapies, I didn't get, nobody taught me about trauma or PTSD or how to recover from it, which meant that as it was unfolding, I didn't know what it was. It was, an incredibly painful experience. And then nobody teaches the rest of the community what's helpful and what isn't. And so they often do the exact opposite of what is helpful and then get mad that their help isn't appreciated. But they don't ask. And so there's all kinds of little tricks and things. But I understand how abused spouses can get caught into their appeasement dynamic of one way or another that actually makes things worse. And I understand the ignorance and thus the cruelty of, blaming the victim. Like the logical thing is, why didn't you just argue with your landlord and say, well, you take care of it? You have to be close to a breaking point and believe that a conflict with someone that has some power has to be avoided, at all costs, in order for you to feel, and obviously I didn't know that the washing machine was going to tumble down the stairs. I just thought, I'd have a bad back after it, because the whole, thing made no sense. But, this, and of course, Billy walks away and raises the rent shortly afterwards. There's not a sense of how can we make this easier. In fact, when the fridge went out, he replaced it with a much smaller fridge without telling me, that we couldn't, right as my wife had moved into the house, and we couldn't fit eggs into the door, etc. And then there's this big tension around, because, with someone that flies off the handle, the most obvious thing is to say, Billy, well, what the hell were you thinking? I just got married, and you decide to put in a 30%, I've never seen a fridge this small. I mean, but this kind of approach, which I'd tried early on in the relationship, when I'd rented the whole house and he'd put his motorbike in the garage, and then expected, I'd rented the house for the garage because I needed a place for tools, and he expected me not to ding up his motorbike and just to leave it there in the center, and threatened to cancel the lease if I didn't go along with that. So I had to become diplomatic to get it out. And so there's just so many compound effects that can come together and snowball with this amount of ignorance around trauma, with this amount of sociopathic abuse, with this amount of disownership. It's a wound that is created by the cult as a whole and then disowned. But Hillman said that it's important to, once you're locked into fight, once you're locked into fawn, freeze, and flee, you have to fight. You have to go into the thing that's taboo. And there's a reason why people have a certain taboo that basically brings up the fear of death around this. So for me, the thing I'd never done was fought. I'd always withdrawn, and I'd withdrawn, and I'd withdrawn. I left the abusive house at 17. I left relationships that were abusive, and I left groups that couldn't accommodate certain things about myself that were important and that I wanted to bring to groups. And so there's this withdrawal, which leads ultimately to isolation. And so I consider myself extremely isolated. I do not have a single American friend that I consider to be a friend. And that's just, okay, that's not friendly behavior. Do you want to co-create a friendship that would be considered mutually friendly, or shall I just withdraw? And so there's been withdrawing, and when your community leader, when Peter Sandhill, breaks every therapeutic guideline in the book, and I develop trauma and grief and brokenheartedness, sexual abuse during a therapeutic session, let alone a first psychedelic session, let alone one where he pushed for much more psychedelic compound than I was comfortable with. There's, again, that pleasing dynamic. I don't want to piss off my therapist, but unfortunately, like my landlord, he doesn't know what he's doing. And so this kind of learning to fight is part of transmuting fear through aggression, an attempt at healthy aggression. And healthy aggression basically says, that if you want to stick needles into my cheeks, I'm going to hold a boundary. Now, typically this would be withdrawal, but what if you can't withdraw easily? Then you need to assert a boundary, say no. And when you're dealing with a sociopath, the fact that it hurts you doesn't stop the effort. A sociopath doesn't stop violating a boundary until doing so hurts them as much as it hurts you. And they don't stop it because it hurts you. That's an empath. They stop it because they don't want the backlash. A sociopath demands that the pain that they cause you cause them enough pain that they don't want to do it out of a self-centered motivation, which is very difficult for an empath and a sensitive. And I want to, I'm in the category, of neurologically highly sensitive people, which I have to always explain because our culture doesn't help us with any of these things by creating a psychologically literate culture. I have to explain this. No, I'm not saying that I'm extra polite. I'm saying I'm extra reactive. A very sensitive switch turns something on with just a little tap. And so what it means is more reactivity, which is a plus and a negative depending on context and depending on the sensitivity of other people around you. If you've got a glass that's very sensitive and someone throws, a baseball at it, it shatters. So the sensitivity becomes a vulnerability. If everyone understands the sensitivity, you save money on glass and it's lighter weight, etc. And the thinner glass is a benefit. And we, of course, don't teach that kind of contextual thinking. So as a sensitive, one feels more pain faster. And so if you're in a boxing match and you feel 3 times more pain than your opponent, who's maybe taken a bunch of painkillers or is just not in that sensitive category, you're going to buckle over and react to pain when they throw you a punch, much more than they buckle over and react to pain when you throw them a punch. That creates a severe handicap. And this handicap is not honored in conflict, it is exploited. Bullies go after the most sensitive people because they can win, because if we get into a conflict, and you can think of it as an economic conflict as well. If a mom and pop store goes up against Amazon or goes up against Walmart, and the mom and pop store lowers the price to outcompete the competition, they can lose $1 million and still lower the price, and then when the mom and pop store goes out of business, then they raise the price back up and make it all back in the next decade. And that's the kind of dynamic you have with a sensitive and a non-sensitive in conflict. And since 80 to 90% of the population is not in that sensitivity category, and 10 to 20% are, conflict is not a good survival strategy for a sensitive. And particularly when the abuser is your father, your mother, and you're an infant sensitive. My body learned very early that I would die if I got into conflict, because the parents can withdraw survival, security, love and belonging, and self-esteem in a heartbeat. Just withdrawing support, and they can traumatize you. And then they can abandon you in trauma, something that occurred, at various times. And they cannot, so every interaction becomes incredibly costly of a conflict nature. And so, hence the taboo to have conflict. But this also creates a very high level of fear, because we have a lot of narcissistic, sociopathic human beings who do not have the technology of attunement wandering around our country and planet. And if you can't afford a fight because there's a sense of dying, and they don't have the competency to attune even if they think they want to, and there's a bullying dynamic of mass, in part psychologically, because these fears create a very young age. I've carried a tremendous amount of fear, and it makes fear a dominant force in my decision making. I'd like to do that, but I don't want to fight with the landlord. There's fear there. I'd like to do that, but I don't want to fight with the employees. Not as much fear, but there's still, a sense there. Particularly at very vulnerable times. And so there's a tremendous amount of gatekeeping and fear. And, this leads to an abuse contract. And the abuse contract that I developed with aggressive abusers is that I will withdraw diplomatically from the situation, and I will not fight you head on if you don't hurt me in exchange. And so there's this withdrawal pattern, and so the abuse contract is formed because There's aggression with a disproportionate sense of scale and mass. Then there's punishment and abandonment when I try to defend myself. So, of course, as a healthy child, when you're hurt in some way, you seek to defend yourself. But if the parents respond to the defense of violation with escalated violation, then the protective mechanism turns inward, and it basically says, warrior in there, you're the biggest threat to our living. Because if you keep advocating healthily for your boundaries, they're going to wipe you out, and you don't have the forces, you don't have the ability to prevail. So if you want to keep us alive, you better partner with the abuser and internalize the abuse. And so the trouble when the self is attacking the healthy part of the self, and the abuser is attacking the healthy part of the self, and a sociopathic cult is standing by, and basically, in a one could say, better you, not me. And I would say that the institutionalized attitude to most of the abuses directed at children are, I don't want to deal with your raging parent, or this or that or the other. The teacher doesn't, this, the principal doesn't, the neighbors don't, the parents of your friends don't. I don't want to deal with him. And he has a possessive right, it seems, to abuse you. So I'm going to let you, a 6-year-old boy, deal with him. Now, when you attack the healthy part of the self, you have regression. You have age regression as well as trauma. And when no one comes to your defense, you have a sense of worthlessness around that. And so this leads to age regression, which further amplifies the sense of scale and inability to win, because a 5-year-old individual can't win against a group of abusers or whatever. And this was one of the things in my dynamic with High, where it was when my therapists together ganged up to kind of protect my abuser and exclude me, that the trauma became PTSD. And so you have fear of death, and age regression, and there's no person defending the healthy self in that environment, so there's a withdrawal. But when you withdraw from a relationship or an environment, you also lose access to resources, and so the world gets a little smaller, because rather than working something out and coming to a peace and then a collaboration, there's just withdrawal. And this leads to isolation. Now, the strategy is, first of all, to avoid insane, dangerous people. Well, that's difficult to do in an abuse cult, and so it's, but that's the general idea. I've fired clients because, they start pushing too much, demanding too much, so it's like, okay, I'm going to stop working with you. And if they drop it and say, oh, I'm so sorry, etc., and don't bother me again, maybe I'll continue. But so, withdraw from clients, withdraw from friendships, withdraw from groups, etc. So avoid dangerous, insane people. Secondly, politely suggest changes, and then withdraw if those changes are dishonored. And so this is, a survival strategy with some mix of flight, freeze, and fawn. The freeze is always afraid a conflict will come up. And when trauma happens early with abandonment issues and you don't have secure relationships with either parent or a family base, meaning the most abused children in our culture do not have a safe family to return to. When that happens, then there's a real fear of abandonment. And so a lot of the fear is, if I take a healthy stand for myself, will this person abandon me? And they're not abandoning an adult. They're abandoning a scared little boy, because when severe trauma happens at 5 and 6 years old, etc., and no one supports the repair of the trauma, the little boy dissociates, but also freezes in time. And so a certain part of the emotional development doesn't happen. And so parts of reality are seen through the lens of a 5-year-old. And so there's this constant fear of the big world. And I've lived in this fear my entire life. It's so painful and, miserable in many ways that it's led to periodic awarenesses that I think I would be happier having committed suicide than living my life, because there's more pain and there's more fear in living than dying. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of constantly feeling small, hurt, invisible, lonely, and in pain in a world that is pathologically committed to not addressing and honoring that in any way, and blaming me for it anytime it comes up. Because that's what ignorant sociopaths do, starting with the parents. The parents decide to get married in a dysfunctional marriage. The parents decide to have children in a dysfunctional marriage. The parents decide to have more children. The parents decide not to learn how to parent and abuse the children. And then when symptoms of abuse present, the parents blame the children. My parents blamed the children for their own marriage. They blamed the children for ruining the marriage. They blamed the children for existing. So you have this dynamic of the big ones are going to hurt you, and then they're going to blame you for the symptoms of being hurt. And no one's there to protect, because no grown-up stood up. There was no adult. There were grown-ups. They didn't stand up. But there were no real adults. An adult is someone that knows how to love. That's what it means to be an adult. Knows how to be responsible. And how you respond to trauma and pain and grief and regression is with love. That is the responsible. If you are able and willing to respond to make things better, love and protection and safety, ensuring survival, security, love and belonging, etc., understanding the situation, that's what's needed. But in a culture of cowards, everyone's afraid of the abuser, turning their attention on them, and so they abandon the victim so as not to be the target of shared abuse. And this is just what happens statistically if you read the studies in the United States. And it certainly happened, in my own observation of myself and my siblings. And this abandonment is probably, and hopefully a source of some guilt and shame on the part of, the cowards. But, because it's pretty cowardly to say, gee, your dad scares me. I'll let you, a 6-year-old, deal with the fact that you're scared shitless about that, because I'd rather he gang up on you than gang up on me, a grown-up independent adult with an independent source of income, etc. That's certainly not courageous. But we do it all the time in our cult. Either by just simply ignoring the children in our neighborhood and in our school, or by, for example, parents of friends of mine, when I showed traumatic symptoms, they didn't want their kids playing with the trauma survivor. So let's alienate the trauma survivor because we want to disown and scapegoat the victims of the massive amounts of abuse that we produce as a cult. I'm not singling out my parents. They were each abused more thoroughly by their parents than they abused me. And nobody did anything to stop that either. And so we're basically saying it's just fine for intergenerational abuse to happen and for the children to bear the brunt, of that cruelty. Well, this is an outrageous situation. So there's rage, and then it stopped with fear. Like, I don't want to fight and find myself in massive amounts of pain, because who wants to hear that they're cowards? Who wants to deal with these, with these issues? So the crisis comes in a couple of ways. So one of them is if I would seek to withdraw from a relationship that seems abusive and where the person is not showing an interest in cooperatively resolving it. So I say, okay, I think we should end. And I'm thinking of romantic relationships here. Sometimes the person clings. No, don't leave me, don't leave me. And what's interesting here is that abuse survivors with abandonment dynamic and attachment disorder are more likely to cling. Because in that dynamic, I'm dad, and they're the regressed little girl who is having tantrums and being irresponsible and all that, but doesn't want to be left and doesn't want to be abandoned. And so this is kind of the first kind of crisis, and I've kind of mapped out part of the abuse cycle that comes towards me, and at which point I need to dissociate from it. And to give an example, I can deal with someone for the most part who tells me that I'm very rude and I lose control and I interrupt people even though I know it's rude. Okay, I get that. I'm prepared now, and I do hate being interrupted. And I can deal with that, and I can deal with them saying, would you, I know I'm going to forget. I'd like to change this, and I know I'm going to forget. Would you mind reminding me? So now there's two levels of burden. First of all, I've got to be interrupted or whatever the violation is. But they're not asking me to go crazy. And this is, I think, the deepest level of cruelty with a traumatic or narcissistic abuse survivor, is someone who is so in need of looking good that they not only want to abuse you and not only want to make it hard to fix the abuse, but then they want you to call the abuse love or some positive thing so that they don't have to feel bad. That's kind of the point where it's like, no. You go abuse someone else and ask them to be insane and call that wonderful. I'm not doing it. So I can deal with a known quantity that is stated and owned. I am not healthy in this way. And I need help from you to learn and grow around this. So now you're going to be abused a certain amount, and you're going to have to work harder to help me not abuse you. I can deal with that. And then when I get defensive when you're trying to help me, and I own it, like, I'm sorry, I'm really defensive right now, you're trying to help me stop interrupting you, and I'm having an internal physiological fit, just give me a moment. So now we're 3 levels in to someone's psychological wound being placed in my lap. But we're still insanity terrain. I can deal with that. What I can't deal with and what's kind of an absolute deal breaker for me, and I'm walking, is I'm a perfect communicator. Aren't I a great communicator as I interrupt you every few minutes and do this, that's maddening. And then when I point it out, it's denied defensively. And then when I pointed out that it's denied defensively, then I'm criticized in some way to deflect. And then so I'm left carrying 3 burdens and being blamed for that. That's kind of off limits. So as long as we're in sanity terrain and there's an acknowledgement of rapport and symmetry, meaning thank you so very much for being so patient with my stupidity. I recognize that I'm being stupid here. I recognize that you're repeatedly dealing with it and that that's irritating and you would have every reason to be irritated. And I recognize that I don't handle this very well, and thank you very much for doing this, and what can I do to make things a little bit easier for you in some area? We're dealing with sanity and reciprocity and responsibility. I can deal with that. And so we're in the terrain of relating. The bit that really gets me is whenever I'm asked to go crazy so that other people can hurt me and feel better about it. That's I cannot go anywhere near that line, because that's what parents do. I'm beating the shit out of you for the symptoms that I provoked with my other many abuses, and I'm not repairing that damage or apologizing or anything, and I'm asking you to live in an insane world where we're doing this all for your benefit and you're the problem. That's the bit where it just gets, explosively toxic. And so I will generally withdraw, but I've had 1 or 2 instances in my life where, as I go to withdraw from one of those dynamics, one of the reasons I withdraw is that I understand that if someone continues to psychologically violate me without any attunement, and I feel stuck together, I start experiencing them as a threat to my existence. And that produces limbic impulses like, hitting or shouting or cursing and stuff like that to create a protective wall. And I understand my capacity to go down that road. But I've generally never needed to, because I just say, I don't want to be the raging maniac around your abuse cycle. I understand what your abuse cycle is, and I understand that there's no way for me to healthily feel honored within it, and so I'm withdrawing, which of course doesn't solve the problem. I'm just leaving someone else more gullible to take the brunt of that person's wound. We give people wounds, and then they go out and share them with everyone else and see who they can find that's willing to accept them. And so there was a situation where Peter Sandhill, again, my sexual abuser, was trying to, I think, recover from all the mistakes he made around the escalating a sexual relationship under the influence of psychedelics by trying to get me to marry quickly so that I would turn to somebody else. And for some bizarre reason, he thought I should marry one of the most inappropriate women I'd ever met. And it wasn't okay with Peter to call any of the things that he had done sadistic, abusive, cruel, unethical, illegal activities, because he needed to feel good, like most abusers. And I needed him to integrate the psychedelic session, and I also needed rapport with someone. And, when you're an abused child, you mix love with cruelty, and Peter had been good at effectively adding to that. He was very charming and had a lovely smile and spoke in a very soft voice. He was kind of the guy that would come up to you with a warm hug and slowly put a knife into your chest and smile and shake your hand and pull it out and see you next week. And if you didn't grasp what happened, you'd be dead. And he's like, what happened? You know, and so it's that kind of dynamic. So it's very confusing, particularly when cruelty and love have been crossed in childhood. And often, you know, I don't think it was malicious on his part. You'd have to conclude that some abuser must have crossed love and cruelty with him because he thinks he has great parents, but he doesn't know how to be an adult. And so, you know, that's often the choice that a child is asked to make, to be loyal to the abuser and be treated well because you go into the insanity of the abuser in their own frame of reference and ignore your own impact. But then if you abuse other people the way you were abused, you think that's love too. And Peter had this effect on me, 10 years earlier, when, he showed homosexual interest in me, and within the first hour of me doing a therapeutic session with him. And this was because he loved me and was so filled with love. And, but the fact that he called that love created a blind spot where I look back at some of my relationships and I realize that I didn't know how to love these people. But I knew I was doing a better job than Peter Sandhill. And so what was the issue? He was the teacher, he was, this, and so, so these are tricky areas. But anyway, Peter had suggested that I marry this completely inappropriate woman, and it kind of gives an example of the wound. So, and I was following his impulse. I was fawning again with my abuser, trying to please him so that he wouldn't abandon me because I was in a regressed state, in love with him from the combination of MDMA and psilocybin, which, of course, when you push a sensitive client to go towards an overdose and then escalate a romantic relationship in it, it's a very potent way to stimulate a deep connection. And then if you call that love, rather than psychological and therapeutic abuse, well, where have I been taught exactly what is love and what is therapeutic abuse? We don't think it's important to teach our citizens these things. And the more isolated, the individual, the less they're going to have friends telling them that's outrageous. And as it turned out, I told one of my other therapists, they said nothing. So you have an incompetent therapist backing up or staying silent at least, and in that silence colluding with another incompetent therapist. And so who's left to deal with all the fallout of this? The client. And so Peter was recommending I marry this woman, which I pointed out to Peter all the reasons we were incompatible, and I thought it was ridiculous. But he kept saying, because he thinks he has psychic powers, he kept saying, all I can see is that the most luminous future for your life is to marry this woman. And so I gave him the benefit of the doubt and pursued a completely damaging relationship. And the wound cycle can kind of be seen where I wanted to leave this relationship, but this woman clinged desperately and argued and said this was really, and I didn't want to abandon her because I knew what that was like. And so I said, okay, I will spend time with you. And it's not like she didn't have good sides. It's just, if you looked at the data, everything was incompatible. But Peter's constant insistence pushed this over the edge. So I said, fine, I'll spend time with you. And she said, well, I can't spend time with you. I'm an upper-class Thai citizen. You have to marry me. I can't even hold your hand in public. And then Peter's pressuring me to marry her. And I said, that's crazy. We don't know each other. I said, besides, you've got to come to the United States and spend a few months and actually see if you like the me that is there, because that's not the same me that is in Thailand. And she said, okay, we can get married, and then if it's not, doesn't fit, my parents won't let me visit your house unless we're married. I mean, she's 36 years old, I don't know. But anyway, I can't do it without my parents' permission and stuff. So I said, fine. So I said, what, we get a divorce? She said, yes. I said, okay. So then they present me with a $30,000 bill. It's a Thai culture called sinsot, where the husband buys the wife from the father, and kind of the opposite of a dowry. I said, this is insane. And then she flew off the handle, like how I was insulting the family and this and that and the other. And I said, anyway, that was a whole nother story. But then she says, now that we're going to get married, you have to meet and come to this dinner. I said, I don't want to. I'm tired. I want to do it. She says, no, you will insult everyone if you don't come to this dinner. I said, fine, but I'm exhausted. I have a sensitive body. You must promise to get me out by 9 p.m. or I'm not going. She promised. And 9 p.m. comes and I prompt her and she ignores me. Completely sociopathic, obviously. And so then when we finally leave, I'm exhausted and I'm angry. And she doesn't apologize. And this hurts me a lot. And I try and repair the relationship by saying, let's come and cuddle for 10 minutes, before I go to bed to kind of repair. She says no. She's mad at me for bringing up the fact that she lied and didn't. And so I said, fine, but I'm going to take some space from you because I'm furious. This whole thing is backwards. You're punishing me for everything you're doing wrong. So that's the abuse contract, right? If you bring up that I'm abusing you, I'm going to punish you until you agree to lie and call because you can brainwash people into apologizing when they are abused. And I meet a number of women who are in that state. I do something wrong and they apologize. And I say, what do you mean? You didn't do anything wrong. Why are you apologizing for my mistakes? Now I understand, how this gets built up. So I say, fine, I'm going to take some space, and I disconnect. And she follows me. And I say, get the hell out of here. You've hurt my feelings. You've enraged me. I don't have the resources to be very present with you. So you've refused for 10 minutes to come and repair this. So I'm taking space. So now that I've told you I want space, you're again doing the opposite. She's following me. She will not leave. I say, what the fuck are you doing? I've never been tailed by a woman just 10 feet away. I mean, it's like a dog. Like, what are you doing? Go away. I mean, I've never been in this situation. And then when I open the hotel door, she rushes into the room before I can close the door and sits against the wall and won't leave. And I say, do I have to call hotel security? And this is the woman, as I'm relaying all this to Peter, this is the woman Peter says is the most luminous person for my future. And you have to understand, it takes a fair amount of abuse contracting and trauma and insanity to go along with, with any of this. But it's part of the hook is the abandonment. Of when you don't have a support network, and so these things can compound in dangerous ways. And so I start to pick up the phone to call security, and then she has a fit. And she says, if you make me leave this room, I will never talk to you again. So she triggers the abandonment wound. But it's in reverse again, like, hug me, no. Don't follow me, yes. Stay out of the room, no. Leave the room, no. And then if you make me leave the room, then I'll never come back. Well, if you don't want to come back, why aren't you leaving the room on your own? I mean, it's just so hard in an exhausted state to deal with this. So I physically throw her out of the room. It's one of the only times I've ever used physical force. And I think this is a disaster. And I relay this to Peter. I say, I've never had to do this with a woman. Why are you saying this is the woman I should marry? He has his insane mantra. All I can say, I look deeply into the most luminous possibility. And so so I flew out the next day. But I had no support network. But this is the point where that just politely withdrawing doesn't work if someone clings. And so in this case, we had reverse love wiring. She wanted to do the opposite of whatever was there. She wanted to do the opposite. But she had her own childhood trauma, which made the relationship doubly unhealthy for her and for me, because she didn't know what trauma was either. She didn't know what cross wiring was. So it's just the blind Peter leading the ignorant and traumatized, and the ignorant and traumatized, and of course it's the client in this case who's suffering. That whole debacle cost me $60,000, exhaustion, one of the most painful couple of 2 months in my life. What did it cost Peter? Nothing. He got paid for his great vision and psychic counseling to take his attached lover and shove them off into another abuse relationship. And he wanted to be praised for it because he was in a somewhat unhealthy way for a therapist. See, he kept pushing me into traumatic situations with this woman. So then I would call him frantically because it was another traumatic relation. And then he thought he was so great because he would take the calls. And so he wanted to be praised for his dedication, and so this resulted in the final crisis. I was so confused and hurt and traumatized, etc., at the end of 6 months of this kind of thing escalating, that I did not know how to deal with it on my own. And I didn't know most of the things I'm telling you now. This took about 1,000 hours of study, to get to become, somewhat aware of these things. But I cannot withdraw because I need help. And so, Peter at this point withdrew. He abandoned me. After, and I gently asked him to apologize for some of the many stupidities in the protocol. So he withdraws and says he's busy and taking space and he doesn't want to hear from me for months. And I realize I can't deal with this alone. It's too painful. It's too crazy. I have absolutely no one. So it's the abused child in an abusive family that is the most isolated when the next abuser comes along, which they generally do, because when the family covers the abuse pattern and calls it love, you don't recognize how sick the next abuser is. It just looks like the same old love as before. And when you are in this dynamic where you're going to die if you fight something, it feels more threatening to confront the insanity. So it makes me pushable in a dependent state, in a regret, and this is very hard to put into words because no one in this cult has been trained to grasp these points. which means you're completely isolated from empathy in a cult that just wants you to get to the point. That's the chauvinism again, right? I don't understand a thing about any of this. And I certainly don't want to listen to it so that I can understand it. And I don't want to read the literature so I can understand it. Just give me the 5-minute version and then go deal with it yourself, because I'm in the paradigm that says, everyone should deal with these things themselves, even though that doesn't work with trauma. But if you don't know anything about trauma, then you don't know that it doesn't work with trauma. And so, so the empath in me found it very hard to leave this woman because she was so desperate, and I could feel it. But there was no way to work with her when the cross-wiring was such that just about anything I said, we really need to do this, I could count on resistance. And then if I said, okay, fine, we're going to disengage, then I could count on resistance there. So there was no way out. And I think this is the point where, one of the points where violation becomes violence. When the pain keeps mounting with one violation and dishonor after another, and then you go to take space and the person clings. And I've actually had women who I understood were abuse survivors, when I've explained why I'm withdrawing, which is the way that you're behaving is pissing me off so much that I don't want to be criticizing you all the time. I don't want to become someone who rages at you, but I'm moving in that direction, and I don't want to be that person for you. And one of the most interesting things is the response from, I think, 4 women, maybe 5. Trying to count. There was, So let's say 5 women. When I've gone to withdraw, have essentially said in direct English, I don't mind if you shout at me, I don't mind if you hit me, I don't mind this, just don't leave me. Well, I mind shouting at you, and I mind hitting you, and I don't want to become that person. But I don't know how not to be with this level of insanity. And I don't think anyone in my cult will understand or appreciate if I take pity on you and you piss me off so regularly that I become someone who rages, meaning that's not something I've ever done. But if I become that, it seems like the cultural narrative is to blame the abusive man. So I get that it's fine for you that I don't leave and become more and more abusive. And the way I track it is I just look at the bell curve of emotion. And if within an hour of spending time with someone, I'm feeling like slapping them, and I notice I don't feel that way around anyone else, and there's actually a system that abuse survivors reenacting their wounds go through to do this. It's a very infuriating system. So it's not that I'm out of control. I just think if I lived a year with you, I don't think I could control how absolutely aggravating you are in your insistence on producing as much violation as possible, and then clinging when I try and take space. I'm pretty sure I would become an abusive person, and I don't want to be that. So let's separate. But I found that interesting because most people, if they're healthy and you say, I'm feeling furious with you, within a first date, and you should find someone that likes you, says, you're right, thanks for your candor, I'll be on my way. But a strong abuse survivor, desperate of abandonment, says, I know, I'm very irritating. I know I'm a horrible person. Everyone tells me that, but don't worry about it. Just don't leave me. And that, that can lead to violence, and I think that results in a percentage. I don't know exactly what the percentage, but that's certainly the only times that I've been vulnerable. When I threw that woman out of the hotel room, it was after that chain of events where she wouldn't leave, and then punished me for, I'm never going to see you again, which was a big trigger at that point. And that was a limbic reaction. I lost it at that moment. I've lost it. Just felt flooded, in that moment. I didn't punch her or anything. I just grabbed her, opened the door, and shoved her. And there was no regulation around that. And I shut the door. And that scared me, because that wasn't the person I knew. But Peter was right on there encouraging me to marry her. You wonder, was it a setup? Was he trying to make me into an abusive person like him so that we could share the shame together? I don't know. But, I couldn't get support for being taking care of myself. I got support to be in an abusive relationship. So because of this abuse contract and this fear of death and abandonment if I go against the abuser, the most easy path in the world for me is if someone just says, I want a relationship like so-and-so with you. How can we do that? And what do you want? What works well for you? Or how can I love and support you in this way? I have all that on the tip of my tongue. That's easy. And it's the easy path for both people. If someone is coachable and direct, it's intelligent. It's a piece of cake to create a win-win relationship with all kinds of people. What's interesting is that I think only one man in my entire life, meaning one human being, happened to be a man, ever said anything like that. He said, I want a relationship with you. How can we go about it? He had attended a healthy relationship group practice that I'd led, and he'd gotten an idea, so that prompted him. But this is the most direct, healthy way of connecting. I want a relationship with you. How can we do that in a way that would work? And then get a direct response. No one has ever asked me that, but that is the easiest path into relationship, and I can just spell out things and we allow time. The price to that is chauvinism, because the first thing I point out is that it's going to take, good 4 hours of foundation laying and strategy. And then we learn about each other. I ask what upsets and triggers you, what adds value, what is an ideal friend, how do you measure friendship, so that we just can map out where we click and where we're going to point stuff out. I like picking my nose, for example, when I don't have a tissue handy, when it's grating on me, and when there's a bit of dried snot in a nostril. And I like talking directly when an issue comes up. So I'm not supposed to pick my nose, and I'm not supposed to talk like that on a video. Fuck it. That's what I like. But anyway, this guy, this was a memorable thing. He said, I can't stand it when people pick their nose. And so I did less nose picking on my walks. I don't personally find anything the slightest bit off-putting about mucus. It's just a substance. But because it was important to him, I did less of it. But I also said, since as a courtesy, if I did ever get a dried booger in my nose one day, I would say, you go on ahead, I'm going to get something out of my nose. So I was sensitive because we had that conversation. Well, who would to know that that was like an 8 or 9 out of 10 irritant for him? But because we know that I'm not violating that unconsciously and damaging the whole relationship, I'm working with him. We have a conversation ahead of time. And I explained to him, I don't believe in following the cult's bullshit around this. It's never harmed me or anyone that I know. Having an irritant that distracts me from listening to you does harm the conversation. And I don't see an alternative since it feels uncomfortable at times. So I get it. I'm willing to work with you, but I don't aspire. It's not one of my ideals to not pick my nose. It's one of my ideals to not waste time on trivial cultural bullshit like this. That's an ideal, but I will make an effort. Or if I forget, I will apologize because I know it's an issue for you. That's attunement. And so this is easy, but the price is you have to give up chauvinism. We're ignorant because chauvinism says that human beings, despite having feelings, psyches, beliefs, value hierarchies, the cult says spend 6 years learning to fly a 747 to get a license, but just go out and fly natural with human beings. It would probably take 15 years for a pilot to learn how to fly a 747 who had a dysfunctional family, a substance addiction, had a time of the month, and had feelings. If you can fly a 747 with all those dimensions as reliably as you can, it would probably take 15 years. But rather than saying people need to study each other and cultures and relationship more, because unlike a 747 they have feelings, we say just let it happen. If we did that with pilots, 99% of all planes would crash. Practice flying a 747. Take her out on the runway, see what happens. Well, we don't do that because we value money, and planes cost millions and millions of dollars. We don't value human hearts, so all kinds of relationships blow up on our faces. So you have to give up that passion of ignorance and the arrogance of believing that being emotionally literate is no big problem. Being a chauvinist, no big problem. Being racist, no big problem. All the things our cult gives to us. And trying to be cool. It's not cool to say, I don't know what I'm doing, help me. It's intelligent, it's true. It just doesn't look cool because the chauvinism of coolness says, I knew that. People lie to look cool because it's viewed as feminine to not know something. It's weak. I want to be one of those know-it-alls. So you have to give up looking cool. You have to give up disrespecting all these things you failed to learn because you don't ask. You have to give up the impatience of wanting to jump into bed with someone who you've got a statistically, 1,000 to 1 chance of being highly compatible. 99% of the time, you just jump into bed with someone, you're going to run smack head on into all kinds of issues as soon as you start being honest with one another and realize that you're not the people you projected each other to be. So that's the cost, and because this crisis with high was the first time this had come up, I didn't know where to turn. My body was collapsing. Then when I turned to high and they denied it, they basically said this isn't our problem. But they had promised in all of their events that they were committed to creating a world where everyone wins. And I always thought that meant not sexually abusing your clients and giving them some support to recover when you do, all that violation. So, but this wasn't their interpretation of the whole world winning. Their interpretation is that when they severely harm a therapeutic client, that the client should go find another therapist to repair the abuses of the first therapist, in a state where it's obvious if all your therapists are abusing you, you don't have the competence to find a better therapist. Because I thought I had found the good therapist. But obviously, I was mistaken. So that causes the algorithm of that decision-making process into question. So there's an issue there. But I found that because they're a public nonprofit and because there are other members of the public who are vulnerable around this, it seemed unethical to walk away and leave the next victim to deal with the same abuse. Abusers very rarely single people out to abuse. It's a function of their chauvinism, of their ignorance, of their lack of ethics, whatever it is. No one picked me like, let's abuse that guy. I just happened to fit into the abuse pattern in a way that worked, for them. So I had to learn to fight. But I was well aware, which proved to be the case, that they would abandon me in every way, cut off my email accounts, ignore me. They actually sued me to stop this kind of data coming out. Even though there's a 10-hour recording of the abuse, which I'm sure they would have denied it entirely if there hadn't been that recording. As it is, they acknowledge the recording and the abuse. They just say it's not their problem. And so in their world, clients should pay to be sexually abused and then pay to be further abused with fake psychic information, and then be given PTSD when they ask for help and are rejected, and the community very often in an abuse cult forms around its leaders, not around the abuse survivor. So, Donald Trump goes around abusing people right and left, but when people ask for accountability, because Donald Trump is a power figure and so represents the abusive father, people feel safer colluding and fawning and pleasing the abusive father figure because that kept them alive as a child than they do standing for ethics and intelligence. And that's the biggest breach in trust and ethics of all, when the community colludes with the abuser out of their own abuse contracts of fear and survival, etc. You're in power, I don't want to piss you off. Here's just one victim. We can scapegoat them and just ignore the issue. It creates, a devastating amount of shame and isolation. And then when I go to fight that, to protect the next abuser, my body tells me that I'm going to die, and I'm going to die alone and abandoned and unloved. And this creates such a biological reaction that my sense of healthy aggression, which never got any practice because I succumbed to the abuse early on, and I've just avoided conflict, never got any practice. So now it's kind of unregulated. It's like learning to move an arm that doesn't have any muscle. It's not very well coordinated. And then that scares me as well. And so I just, found myself terrified in unregulated hate and rage, expecting to die. And, the funny thing is, for a group of therapists teaching a school and a public nonprofit about love and intimacy and sexuality, not a single board member or therapist or facilitator took the easy path and just said, I want to help. I want to how can we do this? What would help this come out? And of course, the obvious thing is to tell the truth and let the community know what's going on, so that that's not on my chest that I stayed silent and allowed the next victim to take the hit. And then the second thing is that people can empathize with me because they don't have to choose between the abusive father. You see, if you have a leader figure that owns the abuse and apologizes for it publicly, they don't ask the community to choose between the leader and the follower, because the leader has shown adulthood and maturity by putting the interest of the client, the public, the therapeutic patient above their own ego. So in that dynamic, everyone in the community will support the abuse survivor, but there will be a reputational cost to the leader. When the leader denies anything, goes on and pretends as if nothing has happened and attacks the abuser or the abuse survivor in anything, now the community has to choose between one victim and the abusive father or power base. And in this scenario, at least a third will seek fawn dynamic to appease the abuser and will isolate and punish the victim so as to curry favor with the abusive father, who will often show gratitude. Trump shows gratitude to people who lie and throw themselves under a bus to some extent. Not always, he's pretty sociopathic, but he really turns his attention. You know, that beautiful moving moment where the one senator voted his conscience before God and said that this was obviously impeachable and obviously a breach of law and trust, and voted to impeach Trump. Fox was after him, of course, and so was the entire, the Trump. And why? Because he called out the abuse. Now, if the dynamic, and it's an interesting thing to understand that there are children all the way up to the highest levels of power, regressed children afraid of making dad mad. And I think that this is really, an opportunity to deal with the fractal pattern of our inner fear of the abusive masculine. That is such that we will throw our country under the bus, we'll throw ourselves under the bus. We will not confront, because at some level we're terrified that dad will kill us. Who's terrified? The traumatized, regressed children within us that our cult has not helped to grow up.